Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everybody. So nice to be here with you today. My name is Vula Baliotis, and I'm a psychologist who works in the Los Angeles area, in Santa Monica and in Torrance. And one of my areas and one of my passions is working with women and men like you who are childless not by choice. So I wanted to talk today about two different terms that I have run across in my own reading about childlessness and involuntary childlessness. And so I'm going to be talking about those with you today. First, let's start with just a little bit of logistics. I know Nikki, one of the coordinators, just typed in a little bit on the chat, but I just want to make sure that we go through this together. So as an attendee, you're going to be automatically muted during this event. I think we just discovered that that is the case. And then we'll unmute you as needed. So I do want to, though, encourage you to make comments or ask questions, and we will try to get your voices up and going so that everybody could hear your comments. So to communicate with us, you could chat, you can click on the chat balloon, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Some of you might have it on the top, but check and find that little balloon that says chat, and that will help get you to the screen where you can type in a comment. A chat area should appear on the right-hand side of your Zoom screen, and there you can type your comment or question publicly through chat. Or you can send a note to Nikki or Andrew. I think Nikki's going to be with us, so you know, you can send a note to her individually and let her know that you want to make a spoken comment, or if Nikki isn't able to do it from her side, you can let me know and then I can unmute you as well. We do want to be respectful of your privacy and comfort level. We know that this topic is, you know, this is an important time, and we want to make sure that we are protective of your privacy. So please let us know if you want to make a comment publicly or privately. So for public comments, Nikki will be able to, like I said, unmute you. You can speak to the group directly. But if you want to make an anonymous comment, please feel free to do that as well. Just make sure that you specify that you want it to be anonymous, and then Nikki will speak on your behalf.
Hi, Vula, just a quick question. Is there any way that you can increase your volume slightly? Because people are having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Yeah, sure, but where do I do that? Is it on one of those little...
It may well be. Try bottom left-hand side where the little microphone is. Click on the up arrow there.
The problem is that I don't have that on my...
Ah, you don't have it on your screen.
No.
That's useful, isn't it?
I see now something that says mute.
You don't want to mute. We want you to be a bit louder. What about trying the actual buttons on your computer? See whether that works.
Okay. Does that help? I can try talking louder if that will help. I don't know. It's on maximum at the moment. My volume is on maximum on my computer.
Okay, it was Kerry who asked. Kerry, can you just type in the chat whether you can hear Vula a little bit better now for us,
Is
please?
it better now?
Haven't got a reply back yet.
Still pretty low.
Okay. Up at the top where you've got your share screen button, if you hover your mouse further up there, do you get anything up at the top?
Mute, stop video, participants. No.
Mm. I really don't know what to suggest then, because I've not had the experience of not being able to get to those buttons before. Okay, so I think we're just going to have to go with this, and if you can talk a little bit louder, that might be the way we have to go deal with this, Vula.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I will try to speak louder. I don't know what we can figure out here in terms of the volume, but I did want to get moving on with our time together. So the reason why I wanted to do this talk was because, well, words have power, and we all know that going through the childless not by choice experience really does entail a great deal of loss and grief. And at the same time, we know that loss and grief are really broad terms, and they can be defined in many different ways. So then I got to wondering, how do we best define them in the context of, losing the possibility of having a child, the hope of having a child, the idea of having a child. I really wanted to see what I could find out there that would help make sense of that experience. And one of the things that we know in the field of psychology is that words have power. When we can name our experiences, or when somebody else can name our experience for us, then we can feel heard, we can feel understood, emotionally held, and then ultimately we can feel less alone. So words also can serve as a kind of a shorthand for identifying very complex processes that we experience, and in doing so can help us organize our experiences in a way that makes more sense to us. And in working with childless not by choice individuals, they often have said to me, "Oh, I didn't know that there was a word like ambiguous loss to explain this specific type of loss that I'm experiencing, which is different than maybe some other kinds of losses." And hopefully in learning about some of these concepts, it'll help you have a deeper understanding of your own loss and grief experience, and also can help you be more equipped to process your painful feelings. By the way, I'm seeing here that we're going to be working on the volume, hopefully. Sorry about that. So here I love Tigdinos's definition of childlessness, and many of you might be able to relate to this. It's a bust yourself into a million pieces condition. And so there's an example where a kind of a definition really can speak to an experience, and maybe some of you might see this and say, "Oh yeah, that's really how I feel." She really captures this in these words, and so in that way, words really do have power. So we're going to be talking about two terms, ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. First, I want to start by saying, that many cultures are very much emphasize fixing, curing, knowing, solving, winning, and having mastery over problems. And this is especially true now that we have such advances in science and medicine and technology, where we really can actually fix and cure and solve and have mastery over many problems. The difficulty, though, is what about when we can't? So when we can't, we experience loss, and loss reminds us of our mortality, our limitations, and our lack of total control. And that can throw many of us into a state of existential crisis, whereas we thought of ourselves in a certain way, and then we realize, oh yeah, we do have limits. We cannot control everything, and it's very, very painful. So Pauline Boss, who coined the term ambiguous loss, has said that to address feeling like failures, we tend to do one of two things. We either deny the loss So we deny that we didn't obtain the mastery by maybe saying, I didn't want it in the first place, or it's not so much of a loss anyway. Or we try to obtain closure as fast as we can. So we might grieve, but only for a really short amount of time. And then we've got to, pick ourselves up by our bootstraps and get moving on with our lives and think positively and just keep moving forward. However, Boss says that closure is actually a myth. We don't ever fully get closure from grieving. We might feel better, we might be able to put it in its place, but we don't actually have full closure. But we kind of perpetuate this myth because the pain feels too hard to tolerate. So we want to say, oh yes, we're going to get closure from loss. And we've been taught that pain is bad, so we have to get rid of it. The idea of living with loss, so living with loss, is not viewed as acceptable. And life becomes an either or. You're either grieving and have to quickly get out of the grief, or you're past the grief, you've had closure and you've moved on. And that really isn't true. We're very complex beings, and we can have very good, meaningful lives, but also experience loss and disappointment at the same time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about ambiguous loss and how it's defined. So Pauline Boss, who coined the term, talked about two types of ambiguous loss. The one of them is physical presence with psychological absence. So, for instance, if you have a loved one who, let's say, has Alzheimer's disease, they're physically present, but as time goes on, there's more psychological or mental kind of absence. And then there's, on the other hand, physical absence with psychological presence. And this is what Pauline Boss ended up looking at. She started looking at ambiguous loss with parents who had lost their children in war, where there was a presumed death, but it wasn't confirmed. So they never got the body, they never had an actual funeral. And then she also looked at immigrants who came to the US and where there was a physical absence of the homeland, but there was psychological presence, and how that kept alive in the cultural values of the family. And there was a great deal of loss and sadness that went with missing the host country. So this is the one that applies more to the childless, not by choice experience, where there is physical absence. The baby hasn't ever materialized, the child never materialized, but there is a psychological presence. And people I've worked with often have said, but it's like my baby's already been here in my mind. It's like alive and well. It just hasn't come into concrete form yet. That's where we are with, this is the type of ambiguous loss that really fits the childless, not by choice experience. So what is ambiguous loss? It's a loss that's not visible, it's not tangible, and not concrete, and yet it is a loss. And what Boss says is that because of that, the grief process is frozen, and there really can't be a 100% kind of resolution. When it's not something we can touch or hold or bury or whatever it might be, then there can't be a full resolution. And she also says it's inherently traumatic because the inability to resolve the situation causes pain, confusion, shock, distress, and often immobilization. Finding closure is especially impossible with ambiguous loss because there oftentimes isn't even official recognition of there being a real loss. And this is something that often happens for people who are childless, not by choice, where there isn't sort of that one day where something happens and, the child is gone. It's that your child has never been here, and then there might be a kind of a dawning awareness across time that there has been a loss, but that there may not be a concrete time where that specifically happens, and so finding that closure could be very, very difficult. And then the need to identify oneself as childless might be the only way to make the loss more concrete or tangible. I mean, that's how we even have words like childless not by choice, or NOMOs, or involuntarily childless. It's some way to put some kind of form to the experience and to try to make it a little bit more concrete or tangible. And as I'm saying this, I'm struck by the fact that this is why we're all here too, is we are coming together in this summit, having named this as a way that identifies the group who's meeting up to talk about these issues. I wanted to just take a quick moment. Are you able to hear me? Anyone?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I wanted to just lay out some of the ambiguous losses that are experienced by people who are involuntarily childless. And before I put up what I came up with, I'd love to hear from some of you and hear what are some, now that you know, an ambiguous loss. It's a specific kind of a loss. It doesn't just apply to childless, not by choice individuals, but it really explains the experience. Can you share some of the ambiguous losses that you're experiencing along the way with recognizing that you're childless, not by choice?
Vula, there haven't been any comments yet about this in the chat, so I thought that I would reply to you so that you're not sat there twiddling your thumbs. And it may not sort of be exactly what you asked, but one of the things that I had just written in the chat was the fact that this has made an awful lot of sense about the different types of ambiguous loss, and going into that in a bit more detail, because I had always felt that the grief over being childless not by choice was much more overwhelming and harder to deal with than other grief I had experienced. And I lost my father died when I was 26. My mother died 18 months later. And my stepfather died, I think it was about 5 or 6 years after that. And I've always felt a little bit almost uncomfortable with the fact that I was actually finding it hard to grieve for the children that I never had than grieving for my parents who I'd known and loved for all of those years.
Yeah, you're really speaking to what Pauline Boss really talks about, that it does become harder because it is ambiguous and there isn't something concrete like you're seeing the falling apart of an ill body, or preparing for a funeral, or having a funeral, having people come and grieve with you. It's a very different kind of loss. And yes, I think a lot of people would relate to that, even some of you listening today. Thank you so much for sharing about that. I'm seeing here also, I feel that my creativity was rejected and that I failed to provide an addition to the community. I miscarried, so I worried that the growing child did not like me and therefore left. Oh, that is so painful. And yes, such an ambiguous loss. That you didn't even get to talk to your child and sort that out. Even, that there is an ambiguous loss there. Definitely. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing. Here are some other ones. Feel free to share some more if anything comes up. Loss of family tradition building, definitely. have that on here as well. So here are some: loss of experiencing physically giving birth, loss of breastfeeding and taking on the role of parenthood, missing out on the customs, culture, and landmark moments of family life, like a lot of you, like some of you are talking about on the chat. So missing a baby shower, missing first days of school, holidays, birthdays, all of that. A lot of times people have told me that they feel really disregarded in their viewpoint of how children should be raised in society. So if you have a viewpoint about where parenting trends are going and what's helpful and what isn't, you might feel very disregarded about that point of view, where people might, many people have, reported to me like, well, what do you really know? You're not a parent, so you really don't know what it's like to be in the thick of it. So your viewpoint could get disregarded. Loss of friends, or loss of at least access to friends who you might have been close with, who are now parents and part of a ready-made community. I'm seeing that here with Helen saying connection to others. And it might not be, it might be ambiguous, because it might not be that you actually had a falling out with that friendship, but just that you don't have access to those friendships because people are necessarily very busy with their children and are now involved with other parents a lot of the times, given what they have to do for their children. There's another loss: never being able to heal childhood wounds by knowing that you could at least attempt to do a better job with your own children. Never being able to understand your own parents from a parent's perspective. And this is something I hear from parents that I work with, that they'll often say, well, now I really understand my parents. Now that I'm a parent, I could really understand maybe, something that my parents struggled with when they parented me. And then there becomes a kind of a shared experience between them and their parents, which is another loss when you can't have your own child. Loss of becoming a grandparent, possibly, and of providing grandchildren for your own parents. I'm saying here, healing childhood wounds was a big one for me. The loss of not feeling a baby grow inside of me through the whole school community and helping a child develop. Loss of creating my own tribe. Feeling like I don't fit in society. These are all ambiguous losses. Loss of being the parent of your partner's children and of experiencing the shared journey together. I know, Nikki, you talked about that this morning in your video that you put up. Loss of providing nieces and nephews for your siblings and cousins for your siblings' children. Here, seeing loss of respect. Yes, I really should add that on here too. No descendants on whom to impart culture, rituals, values, beliefs, and accumulated wealth. And this is one I hear about a lot, how painful it is to not be able to make the cookies that your own mother might have made, or be able to share something about your own culture with your children and be able to connect with your children through those kinds of rituals, and to not have anybody to give what you worked so hard for, and to be able to pass that on. Loss of the ability to rely on your child to look after you in old age. And I know that might be in fantasy, but it's nice to be able to have that fantasy for a little while at least. Loss of the consolation that you will live on through your children. You must face death anxiety head on. And again, this can bring on existential crisis earlier on in life than it may for others, which may ultimately be helpful to you too, but can be very, very painful. And the loss of the social setup of having a funeral or a ritual to honor the child who never materialized, along with your support system. So that's where something like a funeral or holding Shiva or all the different cultural traditions that are held to mourn a loss get missed in a situation like this. I have so many wonderful family stories, such as my grandmother walking on the Titanic and no one to pass them on to. Also having my own future family life, fear being alone and feeling I have so much to give. These are really, they're very painful. Thank you so much for sharing these different losses that you experience. And they are hard. As somebody had written before that one of the stories was very heartbreaking, and it is very heartbreaking to have so much to give, so much love to provide, and so many stories, so many traditions to want to pass on and then to not be able to. Thank you so much for sharing some of this with all of us here. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of ambiguous loss. Because of the ambiguity that's connected to the loss of not having a child, you really might find some additional obstacles to grieving and coping. So in addition to the loss itself, the fact that it is ambiguous can lead to more complications, like more complicated depression, more complicated anxiety, and relationship difficulties where partners can blame each other, blame themselves, have shame in front of their partners. Maybe, I don't know if anybody can share a little bit about if you've experienced some of these complications with having grieving this ambiguous loss. But it really does become a more complicated kind of symptoms that can develop from an ambiguous loss. One of the things that we can do and that we are doing today and throughout this week in this wonderful summit is to just legitimize the loss and to legitimize the ambiguity, which is why I feel so passionate about doing this talk, is just even having this talk is a way of saying there is loss and the loss is ambiguous, and that makes things more complicated. And it also can help to clarify what can and cannot be changed. Again, we don't have full control. We are bound by limits and can't always fix everything. And I think most people here at the summit have come to bumped up against that in a very painful way, that realization. My husband would be an amazing father. I feel like I've not been able to give him a child. That is so painful. And to not be able to share that together. Yeah. Any questions about ambiguous loss, actually, before I move on to disenfranchised grief? Okay, I'm going to move on, but feel free to ask if you need to. So disenfranchised grief was coined by Kenneth Doka, and it fits so well with ambiguous loss because first, the loss is ambiguous, and because it's ambiguous, many times people who are childless not by choice end up feeling grief that is disenfranchised. So disenfranchised grief refers to loss and its ensuing grief that are not socially validated, legitimized as significant, sanctioned or observed publicly, socially or legally. So, for instance, I don't think, certainly in the U.S., there isn't. You might be able to take time off for grief of an actual death, but there isn't. It would be very rare to actually go to your boss or HR and say, is there a day, can this be sanctioned that I have some time to bereave or grieve the loss of not having had a child. So there is the social and the legal way that the loss is disenfranchised. So the loss isn't even recognized to have occurred many times. Like, for instance, if we can think about the loss of a dream, unless we really are intimate with somebody and can go to that place with them, we won't even know that the loss of a dream has occurred. So therefore, it remains disenfranchised. Oftentimes with disenfranchised grief, the griever is not even given the right to grieve. The person often not afforded the opportunity to verbalize the loss and the grief. It does not receive expressions of sympathy and support that are characteristic in a death, and often feels discounted, minimized, denied, disallowed, invisible. I'm wondering if any of you have experienced this kind of disenfranchisement in your grief. Feel free to share if you have. I do want to say, I want to add here that oftentimes the disenfranchiser, or just society as the disenfranchiser, is often not the big bad wolf out there who's just really wanting to deny the experience. To be sure, there are often, there are sometimes people who can be quite insensitive, but oftentimes grief is disenfranchised because there isn't even an awareness that the grief is happening. So there's a suffering, but without really even anybody being aware. And I want to add that everybody disenfranchises others in one way or another unwittingly. We do it to all sorts of groups. We can think about disenfranchised grief, of people who, like, for instance, have lost their faith and might be given messages of, well, having no faith makes you not a good person, for instance, but the person who's lost their faith might feel very disenfranchised because they can't really get back their faith that they lost. So that might be an example of disenfranchised grief. People of all kinds experience disenfranchisement, but it really, really fits the experience of being childless not by choice, because it often is a very private experience and others may not really understand that a loss has even occurred. And the other thing is that often loss is so hard for people to bear that they often disenfranchise it by just wanting to skip over the grief and help you get better about it. Once somebody told me that she was talking to a friend of hers, and the friend said, well, why don't you think about maybe 4 things that are really positive in your life? And so there, the friend was trying to get her out of the grief, but the person felt very, very disenfranchised during that time where nothing positive can be seen. She was really in the depths of her grief. I want to read your comments here. I found that friends and family never talk or ask about how I feel about not having children. Despite being really distressed when I had a miscarriage, it is not acknowledged at all. There is an example, yes, of real disenfranchised grief, and then feeling invisible in your experience, I imagine, or very frustrated. Very painful. Here is Kaufman, who talks about this in a really beautiful quotation, that grief that is disenfranchised has no place to be. Receiving permission to grieve is liberation. Everyone is trying to make me feel better by being positive, but it makes me feel so lonely. Yeah. It is. It's very lonely, because essentially the message is don't be in your grief, get out of your grief, because it's too difficult for us to all bear the grief. So please get out of it. I was told the other day that if I really wanted a child that much, I should have adopted. Yeah, that's a hard one too. And you're welcome for the quote too. There's some good ones on here by people who talk about a disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief exacerbates just like ambiguous loss, it exacerbates the bereavement process. And grievers can feel angry, alienated, lonely, guilty, ashamed, abandoned. Lots of you are talking about lonely, feeling abandoned, helpless. And then oftentimes have to resort to grieving in private. And I have to say, even in couples, oftentimes the grief, there's a shared grief that might happen, but then there's also the ways that the couple can grieve in private. And that might be especially so when one of the members of a couple really wanted to have the child, and the other one might have either not wanted or had been ambivalent about it, or might have wanted a child, but it might not have been a defining kind of desire in life. And so then the grieving can happen in private, and there can be a disenfranchisement that's experienced even within that most intimate couple space. And disenfranchised grief necessarily precludes receiving others' sympathy and support because it's disenfranchised. So when there's disenfranchisement, then necessarily there isn't going to be as much sympathy or support. And it's what we call in the field of psychology an empathic failure. And when we experience empathic failures, they're so painful, and we really do feel helpless, abandoned, alone, rejected. And here is another I think, good quotation to describe this experience. Being disenfranchised is itself a loss. So there's the loss of not having your baby, but then there's the being disenfranchised, which is a loss too. And it's a narcissistic injury to one's self-regard and to how one experiences, values, secures, and defines oneself. I want to look at some of your quotations here. No one around me has ever asked me about how I feel not having a child. I've not ever had IVF or been pregnant and suffering alone. It's tough when people never ask, yeah. I know that some people won't ask because they don't want to upset us. And at the same time, part of me thinks I'd like to know that they're thinking of me, even if it does upset me at the time. Right, and that we can really bear difficult situations, and sometimes the asking, even though it can be painful, it also helps us process grief, especially to not feel disenfranchised. I want to add a little bit here about another related term, which is self-disenfranchised grief, that a lot of the authors in the literature about disenfranchised grief talk to. And self-disenfranchised grief is rooted in the psychological tendency to disavow our own grief. And so it's important to think about how do we contribute in a way to disenfranchising our own grief, regardless what that grief is about. So with disenfranchised grief, the griever becomes not only disenfranchised, but also self-disenfranchising. The griever colludes with societal messages to not allow grief to be real or long-lasting. And I think that this can often happen. I just saw here on the chat, I didn't realize that I needed to grieve. So there's a kind of a self-disenfranchised grief, not because you might have wanted to be harmful to yourself, but because you didn't even realize that you needed to grieve. Somebody mentioned it on Facebook. Interesting. Okay, so it's a kind of a colluding, and oftentimes it's a very unconscious colluding where we see if somebody else isn't giving us an acknowledgement that the grief is important or worthy or valid, that we could buy into it ourselves too, and then not even allow ourselves to grieve. Here's a really important thing to really think about with self-disenfranchised grief. The tendency to self-disenfranchise is likely based on past experiences of disenfranchisement. So I can give an example of, patients who have told me that, a lot of times when we look back, at their own history, they might say, and then I talk about, well, how was loss dealt with, in your past? And, like here's an example. Someone might say, well, I really always wanted to be an artist, but when I kept trying and it didn't work out, the message I got was, well, it wasn't meant for you. Let's figure out what you do like. And so there's an example that the grief was not, there wasn't really a time to grieve the loss of that dream of being an artist. And so as people start describing, or as you start looking at your own history and how have losses, how have disappointments, even if it wasn't grief like a big death, but the disappointments along the way, were they emotionally held? Were they reflected back to you? Was someone able to bear that with you or not? And how does that contribute to how you yourself look at your own grief experience? And do you self-disenfranchise, whether it's by trying to just quickly move past it, or even not having realized that you've needed to grieve? Shame is so important, and I know that has come up a lot in some of the things written on the chat, but also just, in women and men that I've worked with, that they talk about shame with this grief of not being able to have a child, of not being a respectable member in society, or being able to contribute children to our society. And Kaufman talks about shame as being the gatekeeper of experience. It's so powerful. It's a psychological force that prevents the experience of grief from occurring and may outright foreclose the experience of grief, which then really we end up suffering more when we cannot grieve, and it comes back later. I promise you, it does come back later when a grief isn't grieved at the time. The self does not meet loss empty-handed, but rather with psychological history and identities that contribute to the way that the loss is experienced and to what the loss means. And I love this picture that I put up here of this Russian doll, because it really speaks to how self-disenfranchised grief even comes to be. A lot of times we'd like to think about our past as having happened a long time ago, and now we've moved past it and we're here at this stage of our lives. But this image really shows that the little one is still in there, and it's like layers grow around it. But it's not like these early experiences are gone. They inform how we experience grief now. So I really want to encourage you to while we don't have full say about how others may or may not disenfranchise us, one area where we really do have a say is in how we self-disenfranchise, or how we address not self-disenfranchising our own grief. And it's a real opportunity to even just have this concept in mind, and to recognize and to pay attention to how you can be of support to yourself in your grief. I'm getting a lot of permission in the session. It's hard to keep reminding myself of that, and that it won't go away unless grief is dealt with. Yeah. I'm glad you're getting a lot of permission, Carrie. Somebody spoke to unsolicited advice a little while ago about the why don't you just adopt comment. And I do want to cover this as well. Unsolicited advice perpetuates ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. I'm wondering if anybody else has any. I have some that I've added to this slide, but if anybody has any other kinds of unsolicited advice that has perpetuated your ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief and the impact of that, please feel free to share with us. Here's some. Did you see that story about that miracle baby? You know, maybe that might be you. Just keep trying. If you really want it, you will get pregnant. You never know, it might still happen. Why don't you just, here it is, why don't you just adopt or get a dog? Did you try acupuncture, supplements, relaxation, and any other host of I mean, I've even had somebody report to me that they had somebody tell them, did you try wearing socks for a long enough time after you got inseminated? Because that might have made a difference. And often what I have found is that when people get to the place of saying, I'm going to stop trying to have a child, I'm going to try to have a life without having a child, there is also very often a very insistent, unsolicited advice of, you simply cannot give up hope. You need to keep trying. And then that can be very painful, because not only are you not allowed to move on, but you're not allowed to feel the grief, because in essence, what you're getting is the message of, you really shouldn't even be feeling the grief in the first place. You should be trying some more. Here are some other ones. Yeah, just think of all the free time or money you'll have now. Or get a cat. A top psychiatrist told me I should get a dog. Lots about a dog. Let's see. You are much better having a dog. My children have never caused me anything but heartache. Yeah, lots of things that might be true for that person, but can also serve very much to invalidate your very true and real experience too. Any thoughts? I'm seeing a question here. What can you do when family or friends keep repeating unsolicited advice? What if some of you tried? Maybe some of you can add a little bit of help or feedback to Alicia. I mean, as much as possible, I would say be straightforward about that. You know, you would like to not hear any more advice, but maybe some others can share what you've tried as well. In the meantime, I have a quotation here from Jody Day, who just, as I understand, just spoke a few moments, just right before me. And I think it just so beautifully speaks to having ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. So I want to just share it with you. We live in the ashes of invisible dreams. We're haunted by ghosts that no one but us ever knew. So there's the ambiguous loss, right? If we miscarry, if we fail to conceive, or if we never have the opportunity to even try for a baby. So there's all of the ambiguous losses. Our loss remains invisible and unrecognized by others. And then there's the disenfranchised grief. It's really important that you be able to articulate, at least to yourself, if not to others, and when you can, to someone who's really willing to be there in the grief with you, to be able to articulate your ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. I really love this quotation by Kaufman. The very articulation of the concept of disenfranchised grief bears within itself the spirit of freedom. Freedom from the mute and invisible violence of unrecognized grief allows mourning to do its integrative work. And I really highlighted those words because loss and unrecognized grief, it can feel like a kind of an invisible violence, or like an attack. And yet we have no way of putting our fingers on it and saying, this is what happened, because it's the loss of what could have happened. And so that, can often make it mute and invisible, but it can feel very violent to the self when there is that kind of loss. I want to just go back here. I'm a great believer in thinking about your ideal response when you're feeling strong enough to think deeply about what you would like to say to them. So thinking about it ahead of time. And then when you reach the stage of feeling brave to actually talk to them, you've got your ideal response all planned out. Yeah, that's great feedback. I think that this is going to be for a while. So you'll be able to see the quotation, but also you can email me if you want, and I'm happy to send you the quotation as well. I'll move the cat so I can get to my pen to make the note to remind me. I love that. Okay, so I want to talk here for a moment about processing your loss and grief. Kaufman's just got an assortment of great words of helping. So to grieve without social sanction, or to grieve in a disenfranchised grief, is heroic, and something important for you to remind yourself. And there's two types of grief. There's the grief of not having a baby. So acknowledging, that your baby may have really been alive in your mind, alive and well in your, real in your mind and heart. And recognizing that some aspects of grief inevitably will be experienced alone and maybe forever to some extent. Not in the same way as they are in the beginning, not the same way as they are in the middle of your grief process, but they may come up again and again. And expect your grief to feel cyclical with lots of repetitions, and it's not generally going to be a linear process. I have so many times patients saying, I was starting to feel better. I was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and then Mother's Day hit. Or then I went to a friend's birthday party, and it's like I'm down in the depths of the pits, at the moment, and why am I back here again? And then you have to remember, don't self-disenfranchise. Grief is cyclical, and it comes and it will go to some extent as time goes on, and you won't feel it in the same way, but sometimes, maybe less often and with less intensity, and with greater or more quicker recovery, it might come again for a little bit, and you just need to allow that to happen. And so the second thing is grieving the rippling effects. So like the loss of becoming the parent that you might have never had, or of even being as good of a parent as you might have had, the loss of having grandchildren, etc. So there's lots of rippling effects that happen with the grieving of not having a baby. It's really important that both the ambiguous loss and the disenfranchisement of that loss need to be processed as well. And actually, some of the literature, talks about the upset over experienced disenfranchised grief might be the most disturbing and injurious part and lead to insistent grief. And I actually find that in my practice a lot too, that what often comes up as such a pressing sense of rejection, abandonment, feeling minimized is the actual pain of the disenfranchisement of the loss, even before the actual grief of not having the baby can be processed. So Nikki wanted to share an analogy about the nonlinear nature of grieving. Of course, yeah, please share.
Thanks, Vula. It was when you were saying about the fact that you think you're doing really well, and then something sort of basically grabs up and bites you on the you know what. And the way I explain it to people is that going through all of this is a bit like living in a game of snakes and ladders, where the snakes are the trigger moments which send you tumbling down into a pit of despair, or not so bad, but several steps further back. So you've gone backwards a bit, and then you've got the wonderful ladders where you suddenly make progress. However, it's a game of snakes and ladders which has been taken over by the magic of Hogwarts in Harry Potter. Because if you're familiar with the school at Hogwarts, they've got this staircase. The main staircase keeps on moving. So one time the school children will be going up the stairs and they will arrive in Professor Snape's classroom. The next time they use exactly the same staircase, it will take you to Professor McGonagall's classroom instead. And what happens, I found, is
Nikki, we lost you. Oh no, Nikki, we lost you. Can you hear us? Or can you hear me? Feel free to come back up when you get back on or are able to speak again. I'm going to move on in the meantime. So grief is a helplessness to do anything to prevent a loss. And we're really left when we grieve with the task of really growing the ability to bear the unfairness of life. And that can come as a huge hit because we're often raised to think that life is fair, or at least should be fair in some way. And then we realize it's not always fair, and that's very, very painful. It can be very helpful to allow intense feelings to come and pass through, to really grow that ability to hold yourself as you're going through the feelings. Really hold yourself rather than trying to talk yourself out of the feelings. Because the feelings, they do, even in the most intensive times, you'll find that there are times where they're so unbearably intense, and then moments where you can get out of bed, you're still in grief, you're still feeling a tremendous amount of pain, but they are a little bit lifted to some extent. And then as time passes, they may pass through you for some time and then pass on again. They can come at unpredictable times, like we said, likely forever, although perhaps less often and intensely. I want to also really encourage you in working through your grief to remain vigilant about the temptation, and it is a temptation for many to bypass the grief. Having said that, there is also a way that hope can start to grow, and part of our job is to tease apart what is true, authentic movement toward recovery versus defenses against feeling pain. Like for instance, there's a difference between saying, I am feeling this pain, I'm going to write a piece about it, or I'm going to make a painting, or I'm going to work on growing a garden, or whatever else it might be, versus saying, I need to just move past this and not feel it. So I'm just going to keep going with life without really thinking through any of this or feeling any of my pain. I'm seeing here, reassuring to hear about the back and forth of grief. We'll feel much less defeated and disheartened when that happens next time. I'm so glad to hear that. And this talk, and I think all the other talks, will be up for a while, so you can always go back and listen for a little bit more reassurance. Excuse me. Want to put up here a quotation by my boss. Closure is a myth. We seek it because we can't stand the pain. We assume that pain is bad and must be eliminated. And actually, pain isn't always bad. Pain also comes out of our love. If we didn't love, then we wouldn't feel pain. And if you didn't love the baby that never materialized in concrete form, you wouldn't be feeling pain. So it is not true that pain is bad and must be eliminated. Pain is difficult, pain is painful, but it's not necessarily bad, and something good can grow out of pain if we can bear pain long enough to see what can emerge from that. So speaking of emerging, I want to put up this quotation by Anais Nin. There came a time when the risk to remain tight in the bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. And I have found that for people who really have done a lot of work to process their grief and to understand it and to bear it, to feel it, that there does come a time when it is more painful to stay in the grief than to move forward in some way. Not that the grief fully goes away, but that good things, exciting things, the beauty in life starts to be felt again. And there's more of a curiosity of how can life be without my baby? It's really, really useful, I think, to understand that holding on to grief does serve a purpose. And I say this so that you can understand it with compassion, not with self-blame. But sometimes, holding on to grief might be a way to keep you connected to your unborn baby. And you might even find yourself feeling guilty and scared to let go of the grief when you start to feel a little less grief. There might be an anxiety that even comes up, like, uh-oh, if I don't feel the grief, does that mean I'm really letting go? And does that mean that I didn't really want to have this baby? And does that mean that I wouldn't have really loved this baby if I had it? So you might even find yourself at times wanting to hold on to your grief to serve that purpose of trying to keep that connection. But also you might find yourself discovering hope in having a life without a child. And what we know is that letting go of unfulfilled dreams can allow new dreams to emerge. One of the things that you might find is other ways to create or to parent, to mother, to father, in ways that really might not have been apparent before. You might not have even seen them because you weren't looking for them, or new opportunities come up in ways that you really may never have imagined before. And many, many women and men that I work with have had this experience as time has gone on. You might find alternate ways to heal childhood wounds. And even, yes, I know that it might seem very, very hard in the depths of the grief, but you might even find yourself at some point appreciate and take advantage of what things can be more possible by not having a child. We're all bound by the limits of our mortality and of the limits of time and space, and having a child and committing a life to having a child takes up time and space and energy, and there might be other things that you discover that may be very fulfilling for you by not having a child. I also want to say that respectfully, because I know that in the depths of grief, it's very, very hard to imagine that, and I would never recommend jumping to this point when you're in the depths of grief, but just something to anticipate that might be possible for you in the future. Those few around me who know about my feelings don't know how to respond. Thank you for understanding it and out loud. Understand that idea of holding on, really struggling with that. Thank you for sharing that. Also, in allowing for new beginnings doesn't mean, if we remember the Russian doll, it doesn't mean just getting over being childless. That will always, that experience of grief will always be there. It's always going to be an important part of what makes you who you are. So coming to terms, it doesn't have to be either or, coming to terms with a new beginning or finding a new path, or, what Jody Day calls your plan B, doesn't necessarily mean that, this is still one part of your identity. But you can find a way to put it in its place. And one thing that patients often will find their own way of describing to me is that there's a little part within the larger circle of who they are that can hold on to that love of that baby that never was, but it doesn't have to consume everything else with time. And it doesn't have to define every aspect of who you are. Here toward the end of our time together, I'm seeing here and I'm back. Nikki, did you want to come back and finish sharing your analogy before I move toward the end of our time together?
Yes, thank you very much, Vula. Sorry about that. My computer just suddenly crashed on me, and it's taken me all this time to be able to reboot and get back in. So my apologies to everybody. I'm not quite sure where I was. I was talking about Snakes and Ladders and Hogwarts, and the fact that you can be going along knowing that you've got coming ahead of you perhaps a ladder which is going to help you to sort of move forward quite a lot, and you're so concentrated, you're fixed on the fact that just around the corner something is going to help me, but you don't actually realize that one of the snakes has moved and you can fall down the rabbit hole, if you like. I'm mixing my literary references there, but it does feel sometimes like you are in this bizarre game of snakes and ladders where everything keeps on moving and you basically can't trust the ground under your feet just in case it happens again.
Oh, that is so true. Thank you so much for sharing that.
My pleasure. And I'm glad to be back.
Glad to have you back.
Good.
So I wanted to share this other quotation by Jody Day. I have a future again because the love I had for my unborn children created the grief that healed me. So there's where the grief or pain or suffering isn't all bad. It's a perfect way to describe it, that it created, the love is what created the grief that healed me. I was the walking wounded. Now that wound has healed into a scar, and I can live with the scar. I can dance with the scar. So scars are not the end of the world. They are so painful, but they also are something that we really can grow to live with and even find joy again. I'm happy to provide this to anybody who wants this quotation as well. So that's it for my talk. I wanted to just leave one last opportunity if anybody had any comments you want to add on the chat. While I want to take some time here, just a moment to really thank the summit sponsors. Without their support and generosity, the summit really would not be possible. So thank you. And also, I wanted to let you know that you could find the details about the summit sponsors on the homepage of the We Are Worthy website. And here it is, weareworthysummit.com. So thank you so much to everybody for being here, being together to talk about this, talk about ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. And I really, really appreciate all of you who shared. really shared your own experiences. And I hope that you find the whole summit to be a time to be together with others in your tribe, and to hopefully help you process through some of your feelings, at least to feel heard and understood, and emotionally held in many ways. So I do really hope the best. And thank you so much, Nikki, too, for all of your work in getting this set up and helping me today through this process. I just am going to take a quick moment to look here. We'll have a while to absorb all of the inside experience. Yeah, it takes time. I can really understand that. Okay, thanks so much.